Hi everyone and welcome. We're in my wormery and it's feeding time again. What I've got on the menu today is a whole bunch of fruity items such as cantaloupe chunks, cantaloupe rinds, banana peels, and a variety of different greens that would normally go into a soup, such as white and orange carrots, some parsley. There's also some cucumber peelings in here, I believe. So it's a pretty good range of stuff, but primarily sweets for them. And one of my other staple food items that I normally feed with is the used coffee grinds. So they're gonna all get fed today. I've got some bins up here, which are now on day 150 of age, and it's been a while now since they've been in horizontal migration mode, trying to encourage the worms to exit the finished compost and make their way into the feeding zone. So the last feeding on all these trays up on the top shelf is 7 days, and this newest of my bins, which is only 17 days old at this point, it was 6 days since that one was last fed. There's a large number of worms in there, and when I peeked in there I could see a good sized divot where the feeding was, so it looks like they've already kind of took a big bite out of whatever food was in there for them last time. So I'm going to give all these bins some food today. So I've got the camera rolling so we can maybe possibly capture a little bit of worm action just in case we encounter any along the way. So let me get some of my bins up here on the table so we can get the feedings underway, and let's see what we can see. So this is one of the two trays that are set up as horizontal migrations to try to get the finished compost evacuated and all the worms rounded up into a single spot. And the one thing I'm noticing, which is a little bit unusual, I normally don't see in my bins, is a whole bunch of little flying insects cruising around. I'm not certain what it is that's attracting them, but it could be related to the last feeding I did. So I'm going to try to get a sense of what it is that's attracting them to see if I can counteract that. It does seem like they're kind of cruising in and out of this feeding zone. That's where I see most of the activity of these little flying insects. Not sure if the camera is able to catch them, but I am able to see them. And I believe they're gnats or some sort of a fruit fly, some sort of a very small flying insect. Kind of a fast moving little guy. I don't know if maybe I just didn't cover up the food adequately enough with leaves. So I'm going to assume that that's the reason this is happening, and when we apply more food to this feeding zone, I'm going to make sure that it is adequately covered this next time around. So as I've been doing recently, I'll usually use some sort of a little catch tray to try to preserve the leaves that I'm using for cover. Because if they're still in pretty good shape, then I'll just continue to use them for cover, unless I have some compelling reason not to. And as I dig down into these leaves on top, I am seeing more of these little flying insects. So it's something to do with the way I fed most recently. And I'm just assuming I didn't cover adequately enough. One thing I also try to normally do is maintain a good level top surface between the two different sides, so that if there is an opportunity to see the food depleted, then it's easy enough to see just by the level on one side or the other being much lower than the other side, which I'm not really seeing too much of on this side. So I'm wondering if we're going to see a lot of the old food that was already in there from the previous feeding. Maybe I'll skip the feeding. So yeah, I'm not sure. Let's take a look. But the other thing we've been doing lately is also trying to assess how the finished compost itself is progressing towards being depopulated of worms. So I'm definitely seeing a fair number of worms hanging out in this nearly finished compost still. So as far as the horizontal migration is concerned, it does seem like it still has a way to go. I believe that that's what we had determined last time we peeked in here. So it's not surprising. I just was sort of hoping to see fewer worms this go around. But that just tells us that there's still enough food in this material to keep the worms occupied and fed, so they're not yet in search of new grazing grounds quite yet. And it's just a matter of time before this material gets depleted of any sort of food that they can continue to consume. So it's inevitable that at some point they'll go in search of greener pastures, as I referred to it recently. So this tells me that it's realistic to continue trying to move the worms, or try to bait the worms out of the nearly finished compost into this new feeding zone over here. So let's examine the feeding zone itself to see how the relocation of the worms is progressing. So I mean, it's no surprise that as we start to look through here, that it is just teeming with worms. I mean, it's it's almost nothing but worms. And it makes me wonder if that's part of the reason that the remainder of the worms and the rest of the compost are still there. Maybe it's just that there's no room for the additional worms to come in here, because there's just nothing but worms in here almost. And here and there I feel like I'm spotting a little piece of remaining food from the last feeding. But for the most part, it's just solid worms throughout the whole feeding zone. So while I thought that it might just be a matter of replenishing the food in here and just allowing the horizontal migration to continue, kind of rethinking this, and I'm starting to believe that the better bet here would be to do another extraction. I mean, there is so many worms in here that it seems like it would make sense to, you know, get these little guys out of here and get them set up somewhere else. Maybe even set up another new bin for these guys. Give them someplace fresh to work, because guess what? We're going to do that other horizontal migration, and we're going to find the same thing. We're going to just find a brick of worms out there needing a place to probably relocate to. And then if we rebuild this feeding zone fresh, I believe that would probably provide a nice, good encouragement to get the worms that are still in this nearly finished compost out of there and into a fresh environment where there's not already kind of an overcrowding situation happening. So, you know, I feel like the best bet here would be to pull all these worms out of here. Why don't we do that? Okay, so I just turned the camera off briefly so that I can dump out the reclaimed leafy material that's in this container that we used a moment ago to just take this leaf cover off the top. And I believe we could just use this container to put the extracted worms into temporarily until we can set something up for them, some other place for them to be. So why don't we just go ahead and begin scooping some of this massive number of worms out of this horizontal migration feeding zone. All right, what do we have here? Here's some of the food from the last feeding. You know, I'm actually very surprised to find remaining food bits from previous feedings with so many worms there. Let's get some more of these guys out of here. Here's another piece of cabbage or something. I'm not sure what it is. It's definitely got a very pungent odor, so I wouldn't be surprised if it was cabbage. Cabbage is one of those things that has a tendency to get a little bit stinky. It's a piece of melon. It's super surprising to see a little piece of red fleshy material of the melon still on the rind. Again, because of the massive number of worms in this feeding zone. Oh boy, hopefully I didn't bite off more than I could chew with this handful here. It's quite a number of worms in this handful. Get these little guys in here. This is just a massive number of worms going on over here. Just wondering if I should have used a larger container to put them into temporarily. Yeah, because this thing is pretty much full, and wow, it's got some weight to it. I mean, it's got obviously got some food scraps and a fair amount of vermicompost mixed in, but you know, if you had to sort of guess at what the ratio is of actual worms to other things, I would have to guess that it's got to be at least 80% pure worms in this thing, and it's got to be, I don't know how much. It's got to be at least 4 or 5 pounds, so probably talking, you know, a couple thousand worms right here. All right, so let's quit all this jibber jabber. Try to progress onto the matter at hand here. All right, I don't want to scoop a whole bunch of finished compost out of here in the process. I'd like to just leave that as finished compost so that all we end up scooping out of here is worms at some point later. All right, so let's just go ahead and give this horizontal migration feeding zone a quick rebuild. Nothing fancy. Okay. Cardboard works well as a bedding material closer to the actual compost itself. I'll typically like to use crushed leaves because those have probably a better chance of being actually converted to vermicompost more quickly, so that the dividing line between the finished compost and the feeding zone, so that when we come to extracting, can have more of a finished compost sort of a consistency here on the edge, right? So why don't we try to make this into a nice appealing feeding zone for these little guys. Use some nice melon bits, as well as a banana peel, and a couple fresh chunks of melon too. I don't want to go overboard putting food into this feeding zone, because it did seem like we've removed the majority of the worms, so I'm not sure how many worms remain in here, but I'm assuming that what we've put in here just now is going to be an adequate amount of food to pique their interest and keep them fed without being too much that it just ends up emitting a bunch of scent to attract more flying insects. So we're going to take this reclaimed leafy matter that we extracted off the top earlier and dump that in. And a couple other ingredients that I'd like to use in here are the grit, which is in my case crushed eggshells, pulverized eggshells. So I'm going to make sure that there's some gritty material in here to aid in their digestion. And then also another material I like to use is the used coffee grounds, coffee grinds, whatever. I'm going to try to apply it in such a way that it covers up where the food is, in the hopes that it creates sort of a barrier, so that the scent of the fruits underneath are not coming through as well. All right, cool. So I'm just going to go ahead and give another generous coating of leaves across the top. And I guess I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. Hopefully we're going to not see as many flying insects trying to make their way down into the food supply of this bin. Okay. Very nice. Very nice action on the horizontal feeding migration zone in terms of, you know, attracting worms and helping with the depopulation of the finished compost. But just from looking at the compost, I think it was clear that this bin is going to require a little bit more time before we can actually harvest this material and assume that it's going to be worm-free when we do so. Okay, looking good. Let's get the other bin that's the same age as this one out here, and see how that one's doing. All right, so now this is a slightly larger container than the last one we did. I'm trying to get a sense of how this one's doing as far as flying insects hanging out. Doesn't seem to be quite as bad. I think all I'm seeing now is just the insects that were kind of scared away from what we were doing in the last bin. Let's do what we did previously, is we're going to remove this top layer of leaves. But you know what we're going to do? Just to make this container available again to temporarily hold leaves, because it's almost full at this point, I'm going to move our relocated worms, our temporary holding pen for our relocated worms, into this container, just because I think we're going to need the extra space if we do another extraction. Okay, so what I've done here was I've inverted the container that all the worms were placed into, so they can be put into this larger container here. Then we'll have plenty of space in here to do another extraction from this bin as well. You can see this is just chock full of worms. All right, great. Then this container will be ready for us to put the reclaimed leaves into. Okay, so now got a couple worms in here, not the end of the world, that's fine. Ooh, kind of sloppy action here. Trying to do this reclaiming of the leaves in a way that I don't scatter it all over the place. All right, it'll just have to do. Okay, now, like we did before, we're going to try to do a quick assessment over here of how the depopulation of the nearly finished compost is progressing. So let's poke around down in here and see how things look. I already see one or two worms. I see more worms, and yet more worms. It's unusual because last week when we did this, it was starting to appear as if one of the bins, and I thought it was this one, was really progressing nicely towards the compost being depopulated of worms. But for whatever reason, I feel like I'm finding a whole bunch of worms hanging out in this material, which I thought a week ago was already for the most part depopulated. I mean, I could be remembering incorrectly. But on the other hand, it could just be caused by potentially maybe just an overpopulation of worms within the feeding zone. Maybe it's attracting worms, but it's also repelling them now because it's just become so crowded. So let's see what we see in here. I'm assuming that we're going to once again encounter kind of a very heavily populated feeding zone here. And I think it's probably going to be best to depopulate it and rebuild it so that we can spur on the horizontal migration and encourage the remaining worms in the material to exit. I'm going to treat this as finished compost, or is it mostly coffee? It's hard to say. Maybe it's just best to extract it with the worms. Yep, I think we're encountering much of the same here. It's a very densely populated feeding zone. So I think it's best that we just go ahead and we extract. Maybe if I reposition the camera just a little bit, we can better keep track of what's happening here and capture it on video. So I'm going to start Pulling these guys out of here one handful at a time. A lot of worms. Even this large container full of worms is really starting to fill up. Tremendous number of worms. Crazy, just look at them all. Wow. And I mean, I'm holding this container with one hand and I can barely hold it. It's so heavy. And, you know, I don't really consider myself a lightweight. I got pretty strong hands and pretty strong arms. This is a super heavy container, chock full of worms. Incredible. So I'm not going to extract any more. We're going to go ahead and we're going to rebuild this really quick. And we're just going to let this action continue in here. Hopefully allowing the remainder of the worms in this bin to eventually make their way out of the material so that we have worm-free castings that we can finally harvest. Alright. So many worms. It's incredible. Thousands of worms. And so many more to go down in here. Alright. Like we did earlier, I'm just going to follow suit with what we did previously. Just going to go ahead and sort of create a nice cardboard bedding for them on the far outer edge, which at some point I guess will also become the section that we attempt to extract the worms out of, along with any lingering bedding or food that remains at the time. I'm going to use another more easily eaten carbon-based bedding material right on the perimeter, which is leaves. And we're going to provide a similar feeding for them as we did in the last bin. Perhaps just a little bit more because this is a larger tray. Although I thought that by now there'd be fewer worms in this material than there were, so I was a little bit surprised. I guess we're gonna again try to mask all of this delectable, sweet smelling food from any sort of inquiring flying bugs that might be attracted to it by covering it as best we can. So I'm going to use all that reclaimed leafy matter that we took off the top of the feeding zone earlier to put down sort of an initial buffer layer to hold the scent of the food down. We'll make sure we add grit like we did earlier. And then we'll top it all off as we did previously with a little bit more coffee. And I guess the acidity of the coffee going right onto the pulverized eggshell is probably a good way to sort of neutralize any sort of pH imbalance that could be caused by that. I believe that the crushed eggshell has that ability to neutralize the acidity of the coffee grinds. We'll top it all off with a nice, generous top layer of crushed leaves. So hopefully we've done an adequate amount of prep on these two feeding zones to keep down the flying insect population. Granted, this one wasn't nearly as bad as the last one was, so I'm just hoping that it works and stop seeing all these little flying insects cruising around my worm bins. Alright, man oh man, do we have a lot of worms out of these bins. And it seems like we've still got a little bit of time to go before we can consider the castings in these bins as ready. So that's my two 150-day-old bins. Let's move on. Alright, now here we have my two nightcrawler pots. African nightcrawlers, European nightcrawlers. Here too I'm seeing a fair number of flying insects cruising around. Not quite sure why. Potentially attestable to the same reason, maybe inadequate cover over the last feeding. Right, I'm going to extract this leaf cover like we've been doing. Got this little plastic container here to temporarily hold the leaves so we can reuse them at the end to top off again. All these little flies. Little fruit flies or gnats or whatever the heck they are. Definitely being attracted to what's happening over here. If you've been watching and tracking the progress of these bins, you'll know that I recently added a fair amount of bedding down into the feeding zone in the hopes of attracting some of the moisture and sucking it up, because the bin was sort of dumping fluid out the bottom on a fairly regular basis. So that's why we're seeing a fair amount of cardboard over here, but I'm still seeing a fair amount of liquid as well down in the bottom. And it's making me wonder if this bin might benefit from a little bit more dry carbony material to help soak up the moisture. I think I will go ahead and lay down a little bit of fresh dry leafy matter down into the middle. I'm almost wondering if I should have just used the reclaimed leafy matter and used fresh leaves on top to cover up with. Maybe we'll do that on the next bin. Hindsight's always 20/20, right? It's starting to look like they have made their way through the last feeding, so I'm definitely going to add a little bit more food in here. Going to drop in a handful of the cantaloupe bits. Maybe some vegetable matter as well. Maybe the veggies on top of the fruit will help suppress some of the attracting odor that's bringing in the flying insects. I didn't really get a chance to poke around to try to see how the worms themselves are looking. Let's see if we can get a sense of that here. Maybe grab a handful of material from down low to see how the worms are looking. I'm not really sure what to compare it to because it's my first time with night crawlers, so I don't know what an African night crawler should look like. I can only assume that it should be a little bit larger than the red wigglers that I'm accustomed to working with over the years. So they're definitely all over the place in fair numbers. They look happy and healthy. Let's go ahead and return this leafy material to the top and cover up. Now I know that I disturbed a lot of the food that was in here and bought a lot of what was down low up high, and I might have actually bought a lot of the tempting food right to the top just beneath a fairly thin layer of leaves. So we'll see how the flying insect situation progresses on that bin. Maybe on this one we can try to become a little bit smarter in the process and do it better. Maybe we'll just use these reclaimed leaves down in the feeding zone to try to sop up any moisture if we see the same situation here, and use fresh leaves on top that are free of any sort of commingled food. Just going to start pulling stuff off to the side. Here again, I'm pulling up chunks of cardboard which were laid in here during the last feeding to try to absorb excess moisture, or what I saw to be excess moisture. As I make my way down to the bottom, I can see a fair number of worms hanging out down in there. What also appears to be a fair amount of moisture too. So I'm going to give this the same treatment, but rather than using fresh leaves to go down into the pit, I'm going to return some of these leaves we pulled off the top down into the hole to be the stuff that absorbs moisture before we add food. Here again, we'll give them a little bit of banana, a little bit of cantaloupe, a little bit of vegetable matter. Hopefully the vegetable matter on top masks the smell of the fruity stuff below. Keep the flying insects at bay, hopefully. Alright, so let's return what we have left of the reclaimed leafy material, which isn't really much at this point, so we'll just supplement it with some fresh to get this topped off nicely. Alright, so those are my night crawlers. These were the European night crawlers. So things look pretty good. Let's get these guys back on the shelf and continue. Alright, so now here's the newest of my bins. I did take a peek under the covers, and it did look like the feeding zone from last time had been worked pretty good. I thought I saw a fairly good sized divot in here, but maybe not. I thought it was more prominent to show that the food they received last time had been chewed down enough to show a drop in the material level in the middle, but it doesn't really seem that prominent, at least not as much as I thought. And man, I'm surprised to see so much leftover food. I had placed a fair amount of rice in here, and it seems like I guess in a little bit of a way, it seems like maybe they're kind of getting into it, but maybe not all that much. Working my way down further, that's just cardboard. It's mostly just castings. It seems like they're producing some nice castings as we start to peel away here. Let's see if we can see what else is happening down here in this feeding zone. This is, I guess, a piece of paper towel. Looks like we've got a fair amount of rice remaining from the last feeding. What is this? Can't really tell. It seems as if, you know, there's some greens here, maybe, can't tell, maybe parts of celery. Here's another piece of something or another. Can't tell what it is. Maybe a piece of melon rind. So it seems like the food in this bin is really not getting gobbled up as quickly as I'd originally thought when I peeked into this bin earlier. I'm seeing some bedding materials, I'm seeing some leftover rice from the last feeding, which might just take a little additional time to break down, but I'm confident that they'll eat it over time. It makes me wonder if maybe I could actually inject that massive number of worms that we just extracted from the other two bins into this bin. I'm definitely seeing jumbles of worms here and there. They must have had a nice something or another to eat over there. So they're all piled up right there. So there are clearly spots where the worms are all hanging out, doing their thing, gobbling up the food items that have been added. I'm just wondering if it would be a mistake to add that many worms to a bin that already has a fair number of worms in it. So I was fairly sure that the number of worms in this bin was pretty high. So I didn't want to overload it with too many worms. Yeah, I think I'm going to leave the number of worms in this bin as is. And it sounds to me like maybe the worms that we just extracted from those other two horizontal migrations are best off in a fresh, newly built bin that we can just throw together really quick. So why don't we do that? I'm going to go ahead and lay down a little bit of cardboard for these little guys. Place in a little bit of coffee grinds, like so. I'm going to try to get in the habit of adding grit a little bit more regularly than I've done in the past, so we'll throw down some grit over here. We'll plop in a few food items, but not go too overboard, to try to encourage them to finish off what they'd received previously. And not only that, but the amount of food that I have remaining here is not that much, and if I build a fresh bin for those worms to launch them off into, then I need a little bit of food with which to build that bin. So let's do it like that. I think I'm going to try to just use some of this leafy matter that we had on top originally. Just use it to cover up with down here. What else do we have? We have, I guess, this paper towel. We'll get that in here as sort of cover for the food. Again, I'm just trying to eliminate the flying insect situation, so I'm trying to keep the temptation away by covering up anything that might have an alluring odor to it. It might draw flies and flying insects. So let's go ahead and start using the remaining leafy matter to sort of cover up with. So now I'm not really smelling any food. I'm only smelling that kind of earthy scent that you get out of any old worm bin. So I'm just going to try to fluff up the edges here so I can see how the edges are progressing. Okay. I think this looks pretty decent. Just wondering if I might benefit a little bit from an additional thin layer of leaves on top. So we'll just scatter a little bit on top here. Here again, I'm just trying to preserve some of the leaves that I've got in this box to set up a new environment for all those worms that we just extracted from those two horizontal migration feeding zones. All right, now it's on to creating a new habitat for those worms. All right, so this is gonna have to go pretty quick because I've got an errand to run. So I've got my little reminder on my Amazon Echo upstairs reminding me that it's time to go soon. So you might even hear in the background the alarm sounding. So I'm just laying down a little bit of cardboard, packed up cardboard, to serve as a bedding material down on the bottom layer here. Something else that's been sort of accumulating as sort of a surplus is these coffee filters. I've been trying my best to preserve them. Every time I make coffee and I empty out the previous batch, I've been setting these aside so as to use them down here at some point, but I'm stacking them up and not using them, so I figured now is a good time to do so. And I'm almost thinking that the material that the worms are in right now might serve as a pretty good generic material that they can just be in, because it's already got a fair amount of bedding in it and some food scraps as well. So I'm wondering if it might be best to simply dump them in at this point. So let's see what we get when we pour this container that's full of worms into here. And then I'll just spread it out, and I'll assume that this already has a pretty good mix of everything we need for a good bin. Wow. That is a lot of worms. So I'm just going to start spreading this out gradually. Probably started about 3 or 4 separate bins with this number of worms. So this is going to become a incredibly hungry bin. I can tell already. Crazy. Wow. So the material that they're in already has some food left in it, but we did set aside a little bit of food from the feeding ration to put in here for them. So let's add that too. Again, I'm going to try to use a few coffee filters here, and we'll simply dump in the remainder of the food that was brought down here with which to feed. I'll sort of spread that out a bit here as well. So now I'm definitely running low on materials here, so it might be necessary for me to head outside and reload my container that's full of leaves, because it's certainly not full anymore. It's really down to just scraps. I want to make sure I've adequately covered all of this up. And that's not going to do it. Let me just shoot outside really quick and grab a little bit more leafy matter to wrap this up with. I'm back and I've got a fresh load of leaves in my leaf supply box. So this is going to be a good, generous piling of leaves all across the top, because I can already see some of these little flying insects that are cruising around my wormery are attracted to the material that the worms were resting in. It is sort of a commingled mix of food materials and I guess vermicompost at this point to a large degree, and bedding and everything else. So it does seem like a good idea to pile the leaves on pretty thick in here, because the leaves themselves will also serve as a food substance for them. And you know, we got a huge number of worms in here, so they're going to be hungry, and I think they're going to start right into eating these leaves. And since it is a bit dry, I'm going to do a little trick that I usually do with some of my bins, which is to place another container right on top to sort of create this terrarium effect. So on top of that, I'm just going to take another bin that's same size, put it right on top. So until such a time that that evaporation has a chance to occur, whatever moisture is in the bin eventually does evaporate and condense back down to land back down on those dry leaves, so that all the moisture level in that bin sort of becomes consistent throughout. I'm going to leave that bin on. It shouldn't take more than a day or two, so I'll check back in on this soon just to see how that massive load of worms are doing. But I guess I need to get myself a new sticker. It's going to say September 30th. So we got ourselves a new bin. The new unexpected bin that wasn't really anticipated for today. So, alright, well, thanks for joining me. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider becoming a subscriber to my channel. That's always really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, I gotta run. Thanks for watching. Bye.